Welcome everyone. My name's Sarah Neal and I'm here to interview the director and writer and producer of Alice, Josephine Mackerras, who's joining us on Zoom from her home in Brisbane and me from my home in Melbourne. If you haven't had a chance to see the film as yet, then please follow the instructions on the video to have a look at it. It's a wonderful film. And first of all, Josephine, congratulations on making such an extraordinary film and for the amazing success it's already had in winning the South by Southwest Jury Prize, which is fantastic.
Yay.
You must be pretty thrilled about that. And I wanted to ask you straight away, when you were making the film, did you have a sense of the success that was to come? Like, as you were making it, did you feel as though it was hitting all the notes that you wanted it to do and that it might reach an audience in the way that it has?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, you can never be sure. It was like there were so many risks of, in this film, even in just the way it sort of shifts genres. And I don't know, I've always, with my shorts, have always sort of done pretty well on the festival circuit. And so I guess that was my only real strategy, was the festival circuit. And I hoped that it would be noticed. Couldn't have foreseen the Grand Jury Prize at South by, that was just mind blowing.
Yeah. And so tell me about the process, because this is an independently made feature film that you did all the key roles on, and I understand were involved incredibly closely in everything from the editing as well. What was the process leading up to this? You mentioned that you've made some short films before coming to the feature. Was this story particularly one that you had been in development on for a long time, or was it a fairly fast process?
What happened was I was actually in pre-production for another feature, but a much sort of bigger scale, bigger budget, with a kind of whoop-a-doobie producer, which took me a long time to get to that point of being signed and going into pre-production. It's set in the UK, and that I fell pregnant, and that kind of got pushed and then pushed and then pushed, and then it just went. Ugh. And so it was just left me, because just to get to that point took so long. I was in a real state of just frustration of this dependence on producer, and getting lots of, getting the money and all of that. I just thought, I'm going to write something small, and something that I can potentially, do myself, or, with very little. And so that was the idea behind Alice, and using my own resources. I thought, I've got this apartment that's got, these balconies on each, so it's really good for light and for certain, and it's quite good for shooting. And also I've got this baby, and I'm in Paris. Yeah. So that was like the idea, was trying to write a really big story in a small space. And so that's where, Alice came from. And then, obviously, the couple and questions I had, and, yeah. So that was the instigator of writing Alice.
There are a couple of things I wanted to pick up on from what you said. The first one is the fact that, during the I guess the gestation of this film, you're also having a baby yourself. Did the subject matter of this, and it's a beautifully domestic film, but it's about themes that are far greater than that. But it has these wonderfully observed moments within the apartment with the child, between the couple, and I think that's part of what makes, to me, the film so resonant. Is it's captured so naturalistically, and there are moments of great beauty in that, in those moments. I wanted to ask you then, was it about the idea of family as you were having a child that helped to lead you to wanting to write a story like this?
No, but I think what really informed the story was how, being abandoned alone with a child, how dependent you become, just how, just how high the stakes are, having a child, without help, which sort of, it really informed how dependent, you become, like, just because having a child, I'm a fiercely independent woman. I always have been. And then suddenly you've got this baby, and it's like, well, you can't do this. You suddenly do become dependent. And that's kind of shocking, to deal with that life transition. And so I think that, sometimes in reviews, when people say, oh, how could she have let Francois back in? And it's like, are you freaking kidding me? You know, she knows she's not going to hurt the child. Of course she doesn't have a choice. And, to me, that's very real. People say that's unrealistic. I think it's, if you've got a child on your own, no, that's very real. So I guess that informed the story,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that sort of I was going to get to as well, the fact that, as I don't want to say an outsider, but as someone who wasn't born and bred in Paris, France, where you're making this film, and somebody who's an Australian and who, as you mentioned, similar to Alice, had distant family, or certainly yours are distanced by geography and Alice is distanced by attitude and a range of things, as well as location. But how did you approach the idea of making a film in Paris when you're dealing with something that's in a second language to you, you have a young child, you're doing the whole thing yourself, as you say, you're fiercely independent. How on earth did you do that?
Well, I wrote it in English and I was going to it was set in London and the outskirts of London. And honestly, it became, the whole getting a producer, just even being in Paris. And that was just difficult as it was. And then any producer who was interested in it kept wanting to change things. And so I just wanted to, it's like from my short film days, you just use what you've got where you've got it. And I mean, I'm bilingual, so it's not the language wasn't really an issue. And I had worked with a fantastic translator, Sophie Satani. She was fantastic. So it was just a question of like, it's just easier to do it here. And I think my idea is I just really wanted control of it. When I was seeing so many producers and some we went quite far, like I was going to go ahead. There was a couple, instances where I was going to go ahead with a producer, and I didn't want to compromise. And also not just the writing, which that was huge. I didn't want to compromise on the writing, but I wanted to be able to take risks. I wanted to be able to explore what I had in here and how that translates to a feature film. I'd only made shorts, and you don't know you can make a feature film until you make a feature film. And so that's pretty weird in a way, because you have to have this confidence you can do it without ever doing it before. And I guess I just wanted total freedom to discover myself as a director. I wanted the freedom to fail without having like millions of dollars on my back. I wanted, I guess, and I saw, it was possible. I had the apartment, I had the baby, I knew great actors, and I had this, of course, Elise McLeod, who was my casting agent. Thank God for her. She was wonderful and put me in contact with so many fantastic actors. So, I mean, and I'm from the theatre, so working with actors is my thing. I write for actors. I love working with actors. And so, it's really, Alice has written for actors, so that's my thing. I don't want anyone, I guess that I just wanted to make the film the way I wanted to make it and prioritize my energies where I wanted to prioritize them, and, and take the risks and all of that. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, you've tapped on a few things there that I wanted to chat about as well. The actors. So your cast and the performances that you have from all of them, even the small roles. As I was watching the film again last night, I really noticed, the nuance of the performances, even from every character who's on screen. Particularly those the members of the bureaucracy, the bank manager, the performances, all of them are really excellent. I wanted to ask two things. The first of all is, had you worked with any of those actors before? You mentioned having a casting director, but were they actors familiar to you that you'd worked with?
It's funny, the only actor I'd worked with before in class, like 10 years prior, was Robert Burns. He plays the third client, the crying one.
Yes.
He's so good. And I knew he was the only actor in Paris that could play, that was, especially that kind of age range, when you're, somebody, is that amazing. Usually you have to sort of get a star. Like Robert Burns should be a star, he's such an extraordinary actor, and he just got that character and he just ran with it, and just, well, you saw, he's just fantastic. Anyway, back to your question, that's the only actor that I knew prior, actually. I met Martin at a party in Cannes Film Festival, and Chloe Borham, who plays Lisa, at another kind of party thing. And then the rest basically came from Elise McLeod. She put me in contact, and I did tons and tons of casting and found all these incredible actors, but it's, thanks to her.
Yeah.
her,
Yeah.
because she's an acting teacher as well as being a writer director.
Right. And I
Yeah.
mean, the Alice, the titular character, is
Yeah.
that's an inspired choice. What's the name of the actor who played her? Sorry,
Emily Piponnier. Yeah.
she's extraordinary, and I think what makes this film, because so much you rest the camera on her face frequently, we're learning so much about her experience through those moments that you've captured so beautifully. And I think she does have this, she's got this doe-like expression, often as in doe, like as in like a deer. Sorry, my strong Australian
No,
accent.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
But
She's
she also,
perfect casting.
yeah, she is.
Yeah.
And I think but she also, I think the performance that you've made from her worked with her to create is extraordinary. Could you talk a little bit about how you choose to direct actors?
Well,
Is it something that you take from theatre, for example?
I think it's really, as you well know from your, it really depends on each actor. Like, for example, Martin Swaby, I wrote a ton of backstory for Francois, and he just took that and ran with it and made it his own, and so that's, and because he was actually the first actor on Alice, attached to Alice. So we had a lot more time, and he really, I just didn't, I didn't need to do anything. That was it. Like, he came, and we'd done a lot of rehearsals, but on set, he was just ready to pop, whereas, Emily came to it a lot later. So on set, we were, I think I really prioritized, I did not, and this is another thing, I guess I wanted that freedom that I keep going until I get every little moment that I need for the editing room. And if that means taking 22 takes, I'll take 22 takes. I mean, that usually wasn't the case, but do you know what I mean? That I absolutely prioritized getting every little moment that I needed for the scene. But she's wonderful. She's so organic and, open, and so I think, it really does. I think most of those actors, they just really, it was just on set, just doing your usual thing. But I guess my thing from theater is, for example, a lot of the big dramatic scenes, I would just let the camera run. Like, I didn't just do this moment, I didn't cut it up. I wanted that freedom. So, and that's one of the reasons I wanted it on the shoulder, was for those sort of bigger scenes that the actors could do it like in theatre, where they can just, and improvise. And, we used a lot of improvisation and, just anything to get them, where they needed to be. But they're
And
all such fantastic actors anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're all artists in their own right. So it's,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I was very
You
lucky.
mentioned Martin as Francois, the husband, and it is an extraordinary performance. I think the one thing that it came to me again watching the film for the third time, as much as it did in the first time, is your exploration of masculinity and the frailty within masculinity. I think is explored in numerous ways through all of the characters, and and I think it's really interesting because it's not something that we see on screen a great deal. Um,
Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because years ago I lived with a guy who was a journalist, and he used to write for a men's magazine. I've forgotten the name of the anyway, but I remember he did a piece, and this is quite a long time ago, before the TED Talks about it and all that, about addiction to porn. And he wrote this article, and the response was so, like, we just never, he was in shock, and so was I. He just received hundreds and hundreds of letters from men who had this addiction, but these letters were so full of pain. It was like, and I know Francois doesn't have a porn addiction, but just this idea that through this addiction to porn, that they couldn't relate to, that they had such problems with intimacy in their own lives and relating to real women, and the pain that goes with that. And I thought that's so interesting, because at the time I would never have thought about that. And I guess that's something that has, and of course in relationships with, men, I love men, it's like, I think sex is very interesting, because you can be very cut off emotionally, but I think there's always going to be, a connection to our emotions through sexuality, of course, and the most vulnerable side of ourselves. And I think we know that much more about women than we do about men, so that's interesting to me. And also, of course, talking to hookers, talking to working girls and their experiences. I was very inspired by a lot of what they told me. you know.
Yeah, yeah, and I think your love, as you mentioned, your love for men comes through in this exploration, because it's, there are moments when Alice first has her first client, and in fact, each time we encounter she is going to a client, there's a sense as a woman watching that of thinking, oh God, what's going to happen? Is something terrible going to happen to her? You play that suspense, and yet what we're confronted with instead is this interesting, and you mentioned this earlier, genre shift. We get a bit of slapstick or humor, comedy that undercuts that fear. And then we also get this wonderful sense of, rather than seeing, men, as we often do in these situations, as perpetrators of violence or of something terrible happening, we see this, we learn more about the frailty or the needs of these individual men. And I found that really interesting in each case.
Yeah.
So I think you've done that with a great deal of nuance and insight.
Thank you. And I sort of think that's one of the reasons why this film appeals to men as well, because everything on paper looks like this should just appeal to mostly young women, but it doesn't. It appeals as much to men, and I think that's one of the reasons, because there is no sort of judgment in. I mean, I guess for me, consenting adults is that's the foundation for me of the sort of moral and ethics of sex, consenting adults. And I guess, the first client, played brilliantly by Philip Dumont, he's another wonderful actor, that he just wants to get laid and he's willing to pay lots of money. Like, it's sort of like he's not really doing anything wrong. And so that gives a lot of permission for the comedy, because, he's just a guy who wants to get laid, and there's no, necessarily guilt in that. I think that's the sort of thing. What's this saying about one night stands, that men are left feeling like they owe something and women are left with the shame, and so, I figure it's actually much better said than that, but those sort of the general gist. And I think Alice, the film, kind of just blows the lid on that,
Yeah.
takes the guilt on both, the shame and the guilt are sort of, and I think that's sort of refreshing, because most of us kind of feel that way anyway. It's just not expressed very often.
I think it's surprising. I think that throughout the film, there are moments where the audience is ahead of what they think is going to happen, and then you've undercut that very cleverly. These moments where there's these shifts of dynamic, and sometimes that's also a slight genre shift too. Well, not a genre shift, but we move from something quite serious into moments of comedy.
Just on that point, can I say that nearly every producer I spoke to, that was a problem. You can't go from comedy to drama to thriller, that doesn't. And I'm like, but that's because my only writing, when I was writing this, I hadn't taken any writing, I mean, I'd listen to, but really my thing was just don't be boring. Don't be boring. That's the, like, make sure on every page there's a reason to turn the page.
I think because, interestingly, as you said, that it is boring. It's a pacey film. Like, I was noticing that again, that, it moves really rapidly. So we're always, and every time we think we know where we're going, it changes again. And that's really a clever use of the writing, I think. A clever way.
Yes, and also the whole idea of prostitution also as a dramatic motor. Like, I'm not that interested in prostitution just in of itself, sex work. I mean, it's interesting for political reasons, but in terms of what it flips on its head in relationships, in this sort of very heterosexual kind of marriage, how those moral, that sort of double standard flips on itself. I mean, prostitution, even the word, can also be used as a like a noun, or to prostitute oneself, or a verb that doesn't necessarily mean sex work, rather. Do you know what I mean? That it's sort of this thing of, we are giving something to something where we're compromising ourselves in some way for someone else or something else, or for money or for whatever. And I guess the thing is, she was doing that in her marriage. She just didn't know she was. That's where the real kind of prostitution was happening, in terms of, it wasn't sort of a fair exchange, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've touched on another area that I found really interesting, and which is around those societal structures. So, when we first meet Alice and Francoise, in the kitchen with Jules, and it's a beautiful domestic scene. Husband comes home, and then the phone rings, and the way he answers it, you know, Farand family, family Farand or something, you know, it's immediately this sort of, you get this sense of, you know, a structured marriage and environment. And that comes across in a lot of the other obstacles that Alice faces, you know, through the bureaucracy of the banks, the financial system, the legal system, the system of marriage, the system of family. I'd love to hear your thoughts around how those kind of concentric circles of bureaucracy sort of started to really, you know, strangle Alice, that she needed to free herself from.
Yeah, I guess that's this idea of the exchange. You know, we live in this material world where and these values are constantly put on the whole idea of authenticity, that within these structures that, you know, often if you're, because Alice is somebody who's done everybody by the books, everything by the books, you know, she's followed what her parents think is right, her friends, she's this ideal friend, she does everything socially right, she's this perfect mother, she's followed all the rules, and suddenly, you know, the rug's pulled out from under her feet, and she realizes that she doesn't even know who she is anymore. So and that's, I guess that's the real story, isn't it, you know, of this film. That's the real story of trying to find some sort of authenticity in herself. And that's why I think also prostitution becomes an interesting dramatic motor for that, because the definition of prostitution is that you're not authentic, you know, as much as Francois's living a double life and he can't be, you know, completely real with her, or he tries to be, and you know, he wants her to keep loving him even after everything he's done. But that 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 for her, I guess, waking up to those layers and layers of just of bullshit that just got really nothing to do with what she wants, or who she authentically is, or what she potentially could be, or all of those things, you know. And I think that's why it also resonates. Maybe it transcends a lot of the age and sex, you know, like it appeals to men and women and different sexualities, because I feel like that's something that's sort of a theme every human being can relate to, is, you know, how to live authentically, you know, and not have, you know, society or whoever's values put on top of you. Like, what do you really want? What it really, you know, lights your fire, and, you know, that you want to get up in the morning every day and do, rather than, I mean, most people live at, you know, work at a job they hate, and they, you know, they do it for money. I mean, that's sort of a form in some way, you know what I mean? So I guess this whole idea of living completely authentically is an ideal that we're all striving for. And so,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. I think it's interesting too, because you know, I think the honest, but well, the portrayal of the sex workers, and that industry is, you know, is done with the voice of Lisa, who guides Alice into it. And she's got a very, you know, and as you said, you know, sex work is an industry. It's a job like any other job that you do. You're employed. You do what you and you do what you need to do. You're paid, etc. And Lisa becomes the sort of her kind of, to my mind, also, as well as being her friend, her guide into that world, by giving her the simple tips of what to, you know, like what you must do. Because of course there's an assumption that everybody would be able to, just because they're a woman, also be great as a sex worker. And of course that's not necessarily the case, because you need to be, if you get being paid the big bucks, you need to be good at it, right? So, or otherwise why would
or
you
not.
get.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting the way that Lisa's character helped Alice to navigate her first experience, and there's a point at which, when she, after her first sort of comedic experience with her first client, who's very forgiving, given how much he's paying. He's actually very, you know, he's very forgiving of her foibles in that moment. But that Alice says, you know, I don't feel any differently. You know, I've
Yeah.
done, and of
Another
course,
lie, right? Yeah, another lie. I mean, in a way that's sort of like, okay, there's another, we've been, you know, this sort of lie we've been fed as women, that, you know, you act a certain way, you know, sexually, that's going to actually, you know, just define you as a, you know, your, which it doesn't, of course. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
yeah. I think that was that sort of sense of it, of taking away this kind of, you know, the things that we load onto the idea of sex work, which are just, you know, it's just, I think what it showed is just the kind of, you know, the basic nature of it. It's like, you know, anything else, making a coffee. I liked that because I think that the realism of it is it's an interesting perspective, and it's not particularly one we've seen, because sex workers are often, you know, it's a pretty woman, or it's, you know, it's either glamorized or it's demonized. I think you just showed
Yeah.
a actual kind of.
Well, I mean, that's thanks to real sex workers that I talk to, you know. I mean, doing research, like really talking to, and I mean, there was a couple of things that I found you know, that it sort of instigated this interest in this was the Elliot Splitzer, you know, scandal. And I think that's a long time ago, but in New York, and he got caught using public money, so he was dishonest. High-end escorts, and two of the high-end escorts that he were, they were outed, and one of them was an English professor. So she had a blog, and I read that with great interest. It was like about 5 years later, 2 years after that incident, it all had been forgiven, and he was re-elected by popular demand or something. Whereas 5 years later, she still couldn't get a job. She was fired as an English professor, and she still couldn't get a job. Sort of like once a hooker, once a whore, always a whore kind of thing. Anyway, so that was like, whoa, this is really, you know. And then also, I remember all those laws were changing in the Nordic countries, in Sweden and Denmark, and they were going to fine the clients. Remember? This is a few years ago, but what was so interesting when they were shifting these laws that were very progressive and, you know, very sort of feminist supposedly, is that they had not once actually asked the workers what they wanted. It's like, I don't think there's any other sort of legal, you know, sort of legislation or whatever where they can do that in the government and actually not even talk to the people who are mostly concerned, because for them there was a whole bunch of reasons why they didn't want that, because it would send the whole prostitution even more underground, and clients would be scared, which would make it more dangerous for them, etc. But they weren't ever asked, and so that to me was like, wow, this is like, these women don't actually have a voice, you know. I
Yeah,
mean, quite
yeah.
literally. So you know, even in progressive countries that are supposed to be, you know, doing what's best for them, they're not. So I just, for all of those reasons, I thought, you know, that was really interesting. And then I met a woman in Berlin who was actually a lawyer, and she had been, you know, I talked to her about it, and she told me she'd been a hooker. And then I met another friend who was a university professor, and said, oh yeah, my colleague it was like, you know. So there is another side of this. And so that, and the women that I had spoken to, they were, you know, they just didn't feel like victims. They just didn't. And of course we know that, you know, there's a whole industry of, you know, that is horrifying, and exploitation happens, and, you know, we do hear about that, and we know about that. But the women who choose it, and I just wanted, that's what I was, you know, that was the case in this film. So why can't, you know, she have a voice too, you know? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Again, coming back to the genre, the nuance of the comedy that is peppered throughout the film. I loved it with the escort, the agency owners, like the two women. Is it Vera and
Oh yeah, Vera and Jessica, and
Vera?
then of course Rebecca Finet, you know, the third, you know, the multilingual one.
I know. They're all of them, you know,
Yeah.
they're such, in a very short time, like the two women are hilarious. Like, just you get a glimpse of them, and they're like this kind of
I know.
little sideshow.
In the script, one of them didn't have any dialogue, and then they came in and sort of cast separately, and then I don't know why I had this idea that to put them together, or maybe I can't remember, but anyway, all I remember is calling back Vera, say, you know, she wasn't at the Metro yet, and I was like, please come back, and she came back, and then I just got them to improvise, and they were just like, what is this? This is so good. So anyway, that just happened spontaneously, that they ended up. Anyway, yeah, they're great.
Did you find, as you were editing the film or even watching it, at the end of it, did you discover things about yourself that you didn't know?
Well, as a director, definitely. It really gave me confidence, because, you know, you're constantly doubting yourself. And on the set, you know, I mean, I would have to fight. So often I'd have to fight to get things you know, or to keep shooting. And, you know, because remember, I wasn't paying anyone. And that's great for the first week and a half. Everyone's really happy. And then they're not, you know. So, of course, you know, because so I would often have to really, you know, just try, you know, to get what I needed. And so you know, people would fight me on it. And I guess, you know, what I discovered in the edit room was, you know, oh my God, there was something in that 23rd shot that I absolutely needed for this edit, you know, and it just sort of gave me why I was making the choices I was making on set.
Mm.
Because there was, I mean, some of the, you know, there's some scenes where there's literally 18 different takes in one, you know, scene. You know, it's really, really cut to high heavens, you know. So, yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah.
if that quite answers the question, but yeah, editing was a really, I mean, editing is like writing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the
Absolutely.
third, yeah, the final writing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Two things I noticed about the sort of the production design, and the feeling that it imparted was there's a lot of use in the domestic spaces of this lovely, beautiful blue washes. You know, when we see Alice having that heartbreaking conversation with her mother, and she's under the sheets, and she's
Mm,
talking to her. There's a couple of scenes where there's this sense of this sort of blue wash, and then the moment when she fires up, and literally when she lights, I'm not sure what she's burning, but there's that, we move into
photos.
the red, the photos,
Mm,
of course.
mm, yeah.
And that's the moment where you just think, right, she's something switched. But the use of color, I think, is beautiful. It's the tonal palette that you've chosen, and that the director of photography
Yeah,
has
Michaela.
brought to
Uh,
life. And
he's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, was that something
I
that
mean,
you worked through a lot prior to? Because of course, I imagine a lot of this is your own apartment.
yep,
So you,
yep, yep. It's really interesting you bring up that particular scene because in a way, even with Emily, I mean, that was one scene where Mikael and I really got to talk about it and work together to find what we were looking for. And even with the acting, you know, it was one of those scenes where it was like, oh my God, imagine if I had a budget, we could work on every scene like this, like really like, you know, get to what we really want to do rather than be rushed and be, you know. So it's interesting you bring up that scene. But
mm,
yeah, no, that's really thanks to Mikael the Light. You know, I mean, he's fabulous. He's really young, and it's his first feature, and just so talented.
yeah,
Um, and and then the lighting, the photos actually in the in the original script, she throws everything out the window and has a bonfire. So you know, of course, you couldn't do that. But I
yeah,
mean, you know, getting the lighting the photos and then yeah, getting just very close on her with that look of anger. It's like, okay, something's shifted. She's not gonna take it anymore. Yeah. So yeah, that
it's
was
got an
great.
impact. That part of the reason I think that the film works so well is the way that we're so close. Like you mentioned that it's all shot sort of mostly off the shoulder. It's not it doesn't have the kind of handheld jaggedness that we often get, but it's a more subtle. It
Yeah,
doesn't feel like a steady cam. It does feel naturalistic, and as though we're walking along beside Alice.
yeah. I really got lucky with Mikael because you know, he's very talented and everything, but his taste is probably more commercial than mine. I kind of, you know, and so it was very interesting. You know, he even there was something he wanted to put it on the tripod, and I didn't. I really liked that, but he are very skilled on the shoulder, which of course is what he does. But the fact, I think the mixture of our two, you know, styles gave the look. And I mean, you know, it was, I just got very lucky. Because he's so talented, and I mean, he only had 2 lights. You know, we didn't have budget. So what he was able to do was just phenomenal, you know. And I guess because also I wanted a lot of, because for me it was so important to really connect. I mean, you know, if the audience don't kind of plug their umbilical cord onto Alice, you know, from the start, the movie's not going to work. So for me, it was really important that we really identify with Alice, so we're not going to judge her when she becomes a hooker. Um, and um, and so the close-ups, there's a lot of close-ups, which you know that was also the whole idea that we're right in there, and it's very kind of intimate, and we're you know connecting to her experience. So yeah,
The beauty of the character and the performance of Alice is she plays it so straight, but she's actually really innately funny in lots of scenes. She's almost like
well,
a
totally, and that was the key in the casting because you know Alice has to be, you know, she's the light and dark, you know. And I mean, it's not all actors, you know, some actors can be phenomenal. They can be absolute geniuses, but they don't have that, that quality, you know, and it's a quality. It's sort of like you sort of either born with it or you're not. And Emily has that, you know,
Yeah.
she can go from the comedy to the drama and sort of slide between those two. And that's exactly what I needed, because, you know, otherwise Alice could be a real downer,
Yeah.
you know, the film. Do you know what I mean? Like for me, I think you know, yeah, I think
Yeah.
comedy's important.
Totally. The thing that really sort of stays with you long after the film's finished, I think, is Alice as a character, her commitment, her bravery, and her humility too, but her doggedness, her absolute and utter commitment to looking after her son however she can, doing whatever it takes, but doing it in
Yeah.
a way that's you know, I think I was thinking about her bravery of all the choices that she makes, because it's not sort of and it's not done in a performed way. It's just
Yeah.
really, it's coming from who she is. And there's a line in the film where she says to Francoise, I want my son to learn about life from me. And I think
Yes,
really,
absolutely. That ultimately the greatest act of taking care of her child, which drives us, is to take care of herself and be to teach him how to live by being the example. And that's huge, because it, you know, and I think that's true. You know, I think that's really, I think children, you know, you can take care of them, love them, give them everything, but if you're completely screwed up, you're going to somehow give that toxicity to them. So yeah, so that's like her biggest, yeah, sort of awakening, that she needs to take care of herself, you
yeah,
know, and be happy in herself in order to teach that to her child. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And also that's why she has to leave.
yeah. One last question. What's next?
The things I'm really excited about aren't confirmed, and I can't talk about them. I'm reading a lot. I'm reading a lot. It's, I mean, it's an interesting thing, you know, making a film, you know, there has to be a fire lit, you know, I can't fake that, you know, and everything comes from that, everything, you know. I think that, and I think there is something, you know, I mean, I think there's something mystical as well about making films. It's like it's like I did this whole film, it's sort of impossible what I did, really. But it's almost like if you have that fire, you know, which is lit by a story you have to tell, and you go halfway, the universe will meet you. They'll meet you halfway. But I've got things I've got my fingers crossed on, like big time, that I can't talk about. But that, you know, and other than that, I'm reading a lot, and I have these fabulous people helping me in LA, and you know, yeah,
Right. And do you
yeah.
imagine film you make, how will you be able to maintain that level of, you know, of control across all the elements? Do you think that's
Well,
something?
isn't it trying to find your kind of tribe? I mean, that's the ideal. You know, I think that's why it's really important. For me, it was really only because I didn't start with the kind of confidence of a lot of, you know, these sort of young directors come there just like, you know, I'm more of a sort of insecure personality. And I guess that having made a movie now, I have that, I know where to stand my ground. I really do. And where also I can listen and be flexible. And that's really important. Like you can't, as a director, you've got to, you know, you can't compromise on certain things, you know, of telling story. And at the same time, you have to be completely open and to everything. You have to know like what is going to make this movie tick, and what's going to make it work, and what, you know, and be very clear on that. At the same time, move with what you've got, you know, and as we know that, you know, you take away money or whatever, sometimes the best creative choices can happen from that. And so, yeah. Yeah, I'm excited now. I'm really excited now to be working with producers and to work with, you know, have a real team, like you know, and not have to go and get the, you know, material in the morning. And, you know, I mean, you know, it's like, oh my God, just focus on directing, just focus on, you know, the writing or the directing was just like, that would be heaven to me. That's the life I want. That's what I want to do till I die. You know, I can't think of anything better, anything more worthwhile. So,
Well, you've made
yeah.
an absolute perfect gem of a film, and you know, congratulations again for everything that you did in all the elements, it's all there. And having known you since we were teenagers, I can say this, that you've always been an artist, and it's really been about finding the vehicle, and you found it now, which is extraordinary. So I
Yay.
think that's the next thing you make.
Yay. It's true, like theatre, writing, music, art, all the things that I've loved since I was a child, they all come together in filmmaking. It's like finding God, in a way. Yeah, because it's true, right? It does everything. It's all there. So, yeah, there's no better job on the planet.
There we have it. Thank you so much, Josephine Mackerras, for providing those insights and for a great conversation about your wonderful film, Alice. Thanks everyone out there for listening and for being part of this experience. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.